Every time I try to pull out of it, they bring me right back in. I told you all I wouldn't do it, that it could never happen. I was done with Bakugan for the longest time, and that was the end of it. But you know what? Retiring from something so odd is dull. Sometimes I seek that thrill I can only achieve through talking about an old anime made to sell toys or watching a match burn down to the tip of my fingers, just to try and feel anything. I guess there's only one thing left to do. One more job. One last time. Until I get bored again and people ask me to make a part 4. I suppose I'm just gonna have to do this and wait for all the comments telling me if I don't want to review the show, I shouldn't whine about it in this obviously satirical sketch. So without further ado, I'm gonna say everything I liked and didn't like about Bakugan Gundalian Invaders. The phases of Bakugan show a clear connection. First, the Bakugan battle brawlers faced off with Naga, a Bakugan from the alternate dimension of Vestroia who wanted to rule them all. After that, the brawlers learned about one of many other dimensions that also had Bakugan trying to take over New Vestroia by using the Bakugan as weapons. Thankfully, with the help of a ragtag resistance, the brawlers were once again able to triumph and save New Vestroia. In the last battle the Resistance had with the legions of the Vestal army, the doctor who developed their technology was able to see a vision of Bakugan fighting each other in a gruesome war. Unfortunately, before he relayed the information to the brawlers, his ship blew up, making us wonder what could happen in this next season. With the introduction of a new character to the group, there was only one option the writers visibly had left. Aliens. Well, they're from a different dimension, just like the Vestals are, but look at them, they're aliens. Bakugan Gundalian Invaders is by no means the best season of the show. Of the 3 seasons I've watched, I'd put Gundalian Invaders right in the middle. Not as bad as season 1, not as good as season 2. Despite being a much easier to watch 39 episodes as opposed to the usual 52, the season happens to be one where the writers decided to put in even more story than usual. I'm still not entirely sure if I'd call this season the worst, because it does have several pretty good moments in it, but then there are scenes that make me want to laugh uncontrollably for all the wrong reasons. I'm gonna try my best to split this video up into multiple structured parts like I did for the last 2, but forgive me if I go into any offhand comments. I have a lot to say. Considering this show has gotten so much weirder, I'm gonna need to explain the story first before getting into anything else because you will definitely not understand otherwise. The show starts by introducing us to Dan's new environment by a beach after he moved. Why did he move exactly? Something, Dad got a new job, something. We all know it's to introduce new characters. Julie is still there, having also moved to the same spot, because of course, but she doesn't have much to do with the plot, so I'll get to her later. As far as new characters, there are Rin and Jake. Jake being Dan's friend from the real world, and Rin being an alien from the planet Gundalia, which is currently under attack. We first see Dan interact with him while showing Jake Bakugan Interspace, a virtual world where people from all around the world can come together and battle with digital Bakugan. I was going to make a normie joke about Bakugan becoming mainstream, but that'd be a little too easy. The point is, Dan actually first met Ren inside the virtual space while it was still closed to the public. Apparently he was able to hack his way in, and Marucho decided that with his skills, he could be an asset to the team, so he made Ren the data manager of Interspace. With his help, the brawlers are able to make clones of the Vestal Bakugan, and even create some new never-before-seen ones for Interspace. After a friendly battle with Ren, Dan gets caught up in an explosion that shows him the same vision of Bakugan fighting in a war that Dr. Clay saw last season. This prompts Rin to explain himself for being a Gundalian, and that sleeper agents from their warring planet of Nethia are going to come try and recruit the brawlers the same way he did. After a few battles with the Nethians, a girl named Fabia shows up claiming she sent the message to Dan and that she is a quote-unquote true Nethian. She loses to Dan in a battle, but Shun follows her, asking for her side of the story. As the Nethians start recruiting young battlers from Interspace to help aid them in the war, more battles ensue until it's revealed that the sleeper agents and Rin are not only both Gundalian, but the Gundalians are actually the ones trying to take Nethia. This could have been a good twist, but the show is called Gundalian Invaders, so what do you expect? With the brawlers now on Fabia's side, she gives them the real versions of the Bakugan Marucho, Jake, and Shun had been battling with in Interspace. The gang tries to confront Rin, but he's already taken over Interspace with the data he had and made the brawlers public enemy number 1. With Interspace still open though, the Gundalians continue to recruit kids without them realizing anything is going wrong. During all this, a knight from Nithia tries to give Dan something his Bakugan is carrying. What the Bakugan is carrying is called the Element, which has the power to turn a desert into a field of flowers, but it can also be used to destroy, which is why the Gundalians want it. The knight loses his partner in a battle, so Dan has to go over to retrieve the Bakugan before the Gundalians realize what they have. When one of the Gundalians unleashes the Bakugan against Dan, the Bakugan transfers the power of the element over to Drago, giving him a new evolution. After this, the brawlers all move to Nithia to help fight the hordes of kids who were taken from interspace and brainwashed to serve in Gundalian attacks. The reason Nithia is being attacked is revealed in the form of the orb, a large ball of energy housing the very genetic code of all Bakugan. The element Drago was given was nothing more than a pebble compared to the power contained in the orb. The brawlers' next plan of defense is to restart the second shield generator of Nithia to protect them, but on their journey they each end up fighting not only the sleeper agents but also the 12 orders. For clarification, whenever I mention them, the sleeper agents' names are Lena, Jesse, Mason, Sid, Zenit, and Ren if you count them. The 12 orders are the upper ruling class of Gundalia, consisting of Stoica, Urzel, Kazarina, Gil, Nurzak, and the Emperor Barodius. Anyways, during the journey to the generator, only Shun is left to fix it while the others create distractions for him. He still has to face Kazarina and Lena, but with some help from Dan riding in, they're able to win. Kazarina covers up her loss by saying it's Lena's fault and disposes of her. The next few episodes involve Jesse and Mason both leaving separately, Jesse being caught and Mason making it away. Zenit feels like she'll be next, so she works for Gil and helps him uncover that Nurzak and Kazarina are planning to overthrow the Emperor. Gil then betrays Zenit and tries to tell Barodius, but he says to keep it a secret. The reason for this is because Kazarina was in on it with the Emperor the entire time and lures Nurzak into a trap. Nurzak battles Barodius and is presumed dead. The fighting continues and Dan uses a new mobile assault vehicle for Drago, which is basically just a motorcycle, and yes, it looks ridiculous, but I cannot help but like it. After that battle, we get a look into what happened to the agents. They were all being kept in tubes after they were punished. Sid is able to wake up and escape to find Ren, but after giving up his Bakugan Rubinoid, Sid ends up falling to his death in a much more comedic way than the staff intended. After that, the 12 orders clear a path for Barodius to show off some newly developed armor for his Bakugan Darak called the Exocore. It's basically the Maxis suit from last season, but this time it has eyes and spider legs when it detaches. Ooh! Ren decides to betray Barodius after he realizes most of the pain he's had in his life is because of him, and releases his Bakugan Lionhalt's secret power. Yeah, I forgot to mention this, but since he was a kid, Ren has been like the guardian of Lionhalt and a dark power he possesses within him that Barodius has been trying to make Ren use. When Lionhalt does use his power, he almost destroys Nithia and releases a mechanical Bakugan called Dragonoid Colossus from the orb that goes inside Dan, leading to Ren figuring out that he was given Lionhalt to keep him from using the power instead of trying to unleash it. Ren joins the fight on the side of the Nithians, but he needs to battle Fabia for her trust. After that, the Gundalians kidnap and mind control Jake to serve along with the other battlers. Dan wants to go to Gundalia and save him, but he and Drago are transported in between dimensions to fight Dragonoid Colossus. If he wins, Drago is given the power of the orb. If he loses, Barodius and Darak are given a chance, as they're the only other beings that can defeat Dragonoid Colossus. Drago wins, but before leaving on the back of Colossus, Dan finds Nurzak and Mason in the void and brings them back in exchange for pledging loyalty to Nithia. The entire gang then rides on the back of Colossus towards Nithia to get Jake back. Shun, Marucho, and Dan go off in one direction to find Jake, while Fabia, Mason, Nurzak, and Ren go off to find the rest of his crew. Dan gets separated from the rest of the group and ends up face to face with Barodius. While this is going on, the other group plans to attack Kazarina's lab and take the test tubes by ambushing from opposite sides. Nurzak and Fabia going one side, Mason and Ren going the other. Dan wins his battle and asks for Jake, but Jake is still brainwashed, so he knocks Dan out. The ambush is partially stopped by Kazarina and Stoica, who fight Fabia and Nurzak. Ren and Mason reach the lab, but are shocked to discover not only are the other members gone, but they're under Kazarina's brainwashing and are being forced to fight. During Nurzak and Fabia's fight, Nurzak ends up being swept away in a flood caused by Stoica, but Fabia escapes thanks to help from Nurzak. While this is going on, Marucho and Shun split up in the castle, leading to Marucho finding Jake, instructing Gundalians on the weaknesses of the brawlers. After the troops are gone, Marucho reveals himself
himself and battles Jake, ending in them both falling out of the tower as it collapses during their battle. After that, the gang meets back up and tries to storm the castle while Mason goes looking for Nerzak. They're stopped along the way, but Fabia is able to reach Kazarina's lab before she fires a ray that will kill Dan. Honestly, by the time Fabia got there, Kazarina should have fired the fucking laser, but nah, she just stalls for an entire episode I'm going to push this! I'm going to kill Dan Kuso! Oh, it's so suspenseful! Next episode. Ooh, I'm still going to do it! Jake was actually asked to do the honors, but he wasn't able to, and right before Kazarina does it, he snaps out of his mind control and basically just tackles Kazarina. Then with the help of Colossus, all the brawlers make it back to Nefia, other than Fabia, who stays behind to fight Kazarina with Mason, and the newly found Nerzak by her side. The 12 orders followed the brawlers to fight, but Kazarina and Gil stayed behind. While a recently forced to evolve Darak is back on Nefia, destroying the last shield of defense, Nerzak and Kazarina are fighting with light weapons. She drops her weapon and goes to retrieve it, but Gil is waiting at the bottom to kill her for taking his second-in-command position. I'll get more into that later, but when she's killed, the rest of Ren's crew stops fighting and changes to the Nefian side. After their fight, Mason, Fabia, and Nerzak return along with Gil and his ship. Barodius figures out that Kazarina was killed by Gil when Urzel confesses to Stoica that he was in on the whole thing. Barodius sends a shot from Darak at Gil's ship, which Urzel tries to block but ends up also being killed by, along with Gil, in a fiery explosion. Dan sees Barodius trying to break for the orb on his own and follows him on Colossus, leaving Darak to Drago and all the other brawlers. Right before Drago and Darak fight, a light comes from the two of them and teleports the two, along with Dan and Barodius, to another interdimensional space. That's when the audience is introduced to Code Eve, the light force inside of the orb. It explains that the original two Bakugan were Dragonoid and Daraknoid, but that the two couldn't coexist together, so they separately made dimensions. One of these dimensions had 6 planets and was called Vestroia, the other had 2, those being Gundalia and Nefia. Code Eve had been trying to keep Drago and Darak from meeting, as they're direct descendants of those two Bakugan, and if they fought, the universe might be destroyed. The reason she brought them to this space is so they can fight in a neutral ground without destroying anything, and whoever wins gets the power of the orb. Dan ends up winning, but Barodius still has Darak touch the orb and be obliterated by its power. Drago gets a new evolution, the Earth Brawlers all say goodbye to the others and their Nefian Bakugan, and the next season is set up. The end. I don't know if that was my longest summary of a season, but it definitely felt like it. As far as the story went, it had its ups and downs, but I feel like it wasn't quite as well thought out as the other two, and when it ended, I had the feeling of, is that really it? I suppose that's what the next season is for, but if this had been given the time of 52 episodes, the story would probably feel much less compact. Moving on, the characters have become much harder to track, but I'll do my best. My main reason for saying that is the villains have doubled from last season. First, we were introduced to the 6 sleeper agents, including Ren, then we learned there's another full set of villains who are actually much more plot relevant. I'll just start off with the protagonist, because since Marucho and Shun stayed like last time, we didn't get too many more. The first new character we're introduced to is Jake, a party-rocking dude bro type character, voiced by Jeff from Total Drama, doing his Jeff from Total Drama impression. For the most part, he's just the typical new protagonist. He starts off losing because of his overconfidence, and learns to follow his own strategy, but his biggest moments I can remember came after he was brainwashed. The thing about this form of brainwashing is it isn't just, making the people soulless shells, if Kazarina didn't want them to at least. Jake has most of the same thoughts his old self did, but now he's subservient to the Gundalian army and has no respect for the brawlers. He's oddly much more intimidating and really made a pretty alright antagonist for the time he was. His other major aspect as his regular self was really respecting Dan like a brother and trying to help anyone who was being picked on, which ironically ended with him being mind-controlled. He isn't a bad character, but he isn't a really fleshed out one either. Princess Fabia of Nefia is given plenty of time to develop. She's a confident character who trusts her gut on decisions, but doesn't go into battles unprepared. She's a decent character, but her Bakugan Argonaut is actually much more interesting. Before belonging to Fabia, his partner was Fabia's fiancé, Jin. Jin was defeated in battle, and Argonaut was taken. He was experimented on by Kazarina, but Fabia saved him at the cost of him losing his memory of Jin. But that's just the thing though, he didn't lose his memory at all. The reason he originally kept quiet was was to try and be sensible to Fabia, but when he realized she thought he'd lost his memory, he just sort of kept quiet to spare the princess from possibly feeling grief at the remembrance of Jin. He was able to overcome this fear and told her to her delight rather than contempt, and it all ended much better than expected. Other than her, the last real protagonist turned antagonist turned protagonist again is Ren.
Ren is one of the more complex characters in the entire show. He plans to take the brawlers to Gundalia and help him, but through Marucho, he learns that he might see them as more than just pawns in a game. When Ren is revealed to be a Gundalian invading Nethia, Marucho can't even believe it and doesn't think Ren could even do that. When Marucho accepts he was lied to and fights Ren, he offers Marucho to come with him and be a part of the Gundalian ranks, but Marucho obviously says no. The next several episodes show Ren trying to grasp at his reasoning for why he decides to keep fighting for Barodius. He thinks about the people he lost along the way, how Barodius got him out of the pit his people were put in, and other excuses, but when he figures out Barodius put his people there to begin with, he stops trying to come up with reasons for staying and moves to the brawler side. Ren was only ever kept around by Barodius because his Bakugan Lionholt has a dark power hidden inside him that when released causes massive damage. As far as character aspects go, Ren shows he's willing to do anything to keep his teammates out of trouble. When he and Sid fail a mission, he begs for forgiveness for the both of them. When Jesse goes missing, Ren finds him and tries to help him redeem himself. Ren shows he cares for people even if he doesn't directly admit it half the time. I would have taken his character much more seriously if it weren't for his legendary voice actor. No matter what this guy says, I can't help but laugh at how terrible it is. Listen to this shit!
That's just crazy! Why would I do that?
It doesn't help that most of the other characters are voiced good to decently, so he stands out among them. I thought I would have more to say about the protagonist, but no, that's pretty much it. Going on to the antagonists, I suppose the best place to start would be the sleeper agents: Sid, Mason, Zenith, Lena, and Jesse. Sid was one of the more straightforward characters. He's a tough guy who sticks by his team, but doesn't deny his fate. In that moment where Ren is begging for the two of them to be given another chance, Sid just sort of accepts his fate and allows himself to be taken. When he's about to fall off a cliff, he gives up Rubinoid and asks Ren to take care of him because he knows Ren well. Sid wasn't given that much screen time, but he was still well defined. Lena was similar in that sense. Her big moment came when she was informed Kazurina would blame her for the loss they'd both received and decided she wouldn't allow it. As they met in Kazurina's room, Lena unleashed her Bakugan, but was ambushed by Kazurina's own Bakugan and given the same fate as Sid. Jesse and Mason both saw what was going on and tried to get out, Mason being successful while Jesse not so much. I couldn't find much personality from Mason, but Jesse was sort of interesting, to say the least. His main gimmick was quoting literature and speaking in a Yorkian accent. He doesn't have much besides that. The real main villains who got plenty of development were the 12 Orders. Thankfully, there aren't 12 of them, which also makes their name make less sense, but overall, I'd say they were fleshed out antagonists. Well, I mean, other than Stoica and Urzel, who were just sort of there, Stoica was the kind of villain who took pleasure in whooping out punishments to his opponents, and I couldn't really remember much to say about Urzel if you asked me. The characters who actually contributed to the story were Nerzak, Barodius, Kazurina, and to some extent Gil. Starting with Gil, he's a kiss up to Barodius, but holds his own in battle generally, showing he's worthy of being the right hand to Barodius. He mainly clashes with Kazurina on issues, yet the Emperor sides with her in most cases and pushes Gil to the side. He ends up snapping when Kazurina takes his position and kills her in cold blood, not even caring that he would undo her brainwashing and possibly lose them the war. That actually transitions well into me talking about Kazurina and what she was about. Kazurina, to put it bluntly, was just the biggest piece of shit. Even more than the king who wanted to take over the multiverse and destroy the brawlers, I hated her with my mind, body, and soul. I love to hate her, and she makes me want to smash something every time I see her on screen. In a good way. She's the most conniving of the 12 Orders, constantly ready to throw anyone she dislikes under the bus and destroy whatever dreams they might have had. She uses her authority to make lower people do whatever she wants. She has a lab that's used for torturing people or Bakugan to try and either evolve them or make them submit to the will of Gundalia. Her entire power of being able to mind control people describes her personality perfectly as a controlling, totalitarian, overconfident ass-face who doesn't care what others think as long as she has the power to do what she wants. She was so utterly assholish that even other villains on her side couldn't stand her, and Gil decided to take matters into his own hands despite Barodius' wishes. Kazurina even showed in her last moments fighting with Nerzak that she thought by defeating Nerzak, Barodius would make her his queen. It didn't matter how ludicrous her plans were, all that mattered was she believed she could get there through whatever underhanded tactics necessary. I mentioned that in comparison to Barodius, Kazurina is much easier to hate, but Barodius has his own little quirks. Barodius is a classic villain type.
type. He wants to control the power of the orb instead of righteously fearing its power like his father did. He doesn't care whether or not the universe can be destroyed if it means prosperity for his army and himself. He might harm his Bakugan in the process of trying to artificially evolve it, or kill some of his subordinates just because it's easier, but it's all for the purpose of getting the orb. That and making Darak the most powerful Bakugan possible. He's basically just Spectra from Season 2 minus the redemption, and I don't think he holds the stage like Spectra does, but he's a decent main antagonist. Speaking of redemptions, that brings me to the final member of the 12 Orders, Nerzak. Among the 6 of the 12 Orders, Nerzak is the only one we get a real backstory for. He was the advisor to the previous Emperor of Gundalia, who said not to disturb the orb and therefore didn't line up exactly with the ideals of Barodius. He also once was so overcome with loyalty to his planet that he sent his own daughter out to fight and never ended up seeing her again. I mention this as it becomes one of the main reasons he turns on Barodius. He sees the power of the orb early on and what could happen if it were to be angered further, so he leaves the Emperor and believes he got Kazarina to go along with him. He's betrayed by Kazarina, obviously, and loses the battle despite fighting hard, but when he makes it out of the in-between of dimensions, he pledges his loyalty to Fabia and keeps his word throughout the rest of the series. Unlike the other members of the 12 Orders, Nerzak knew how to respect his promises and agreements, even saving Fabia from a fast current so he could be swept away instead. Overall, one of the characters I ended up liking most in the series, Stan Nerzak. When talking about how all these characters were portrayed in voice acting, other than the just atrocious performance from Ren, I'd say the voice acting has improved from the last season and has almost no bad performances. One small issue I did find was the characters have moments in almost every sentence where they pause mid-line and continue to sync up with the lip syncing, which can get annoying after a while, but I was able to get used to it. An aspect I wasn't easily able to get used to was the animation. On a quality level, nothing seems out of place for a Bakugan show, just par for the course really. Unlike Season 2, where most of the monsters had a reason for being hand-drawn or CG, that being somewhere mechanical, it just feels random or unnecessary whenever this season does it, which is really little. The CG Bakugan opening animations are still there, but instead of having traps to be the really big toy market there, this season the crew decided to use battle gear. Coming from the last season, it was this added weaponry that was usually placed on the back of a Bakugan, which could give them a sort of boost. Unlike traps though, battle gear doesn't play that big of a role in the series, or in battles much at all. Most of the time it's just character A uses battle gear since they're in a tough spot and can now use extra moves, then character B counters by throwing out their own battle gear as if it were totally unexpected. The only really unique ones were the gun for Lionheart that gets used later on for attacks, and the various assault vehicles that Dan puts on Drago. You could technically count that Drago riding on top of Colossus as one, but Colossus equips his own battle gear, so they can be seen as two separate entities. Back to the animation, it was much more noticeably reused this season. There's the typical throwing out Bakugan and the Bakugan opening up, yada yada, but the characters rarely get new moves, so in like 40% of situations, the characters reuse the animation on a swooshing background that means it could be placed basically anywhere the editor saw fit. One of the worst examples of this I saw was when Sid was battling, the crew reused a shot 4 whole times within 5 minutes. Most of the show isn't that bad, but overall the entire production comes off as much cheaper than Season 2. Every once in a while the show still gets in those really nice looking shots, but I could not stop thinking about just how many times they replayed the same clip. In the end, I didn't think Bakugan Season 3 was that great. I don't hate it by any stretch, it has many of its own good moments. The new characters are mostly serviceable to good, the worlds of Nethia and Gundalia are well established, and the idea of battle gear isn't a bad one. I took issue with how the story felt convoluted, even by Bakugan standards, the animation was worse, the battle gear was mostly not taken as far as it could have as a concept, some of the voice direction made me sigh, and when compared to the second season, it pales in comparison. If I were a rating man, I'd give this a broken marriage out of 10, but as it stands, this season was just decent. If I ever make a part 4, it won't be for multiple months. I gotta get to bed now. Goodbye.